Welcome everyone to this new episode of the podcast, The Next Page, here at Library and Archives Geneva. Today we're going to explore the decline of diplomacy and how to reverse the decline of diplomacy for peace. We are in conversation with David Harland, who is the Executive Director of the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He's also a member of the UN Secretary General High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, and he's got quite a long experience in mediation and diplomacy for peace. So today we want to explore how diplomacy for peace had a moment in history of rise and a moment of decline, especially in the past maybe 10, 20 years. So welcome, David.
Pleasure to be here, Francesco.
A great pleasure to have you here in our studio. And before we get into the deep dive of today's episode, can you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your current position at the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Dialogue?
First, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, to be back at the United Nations, where I worked for many years. Yeah, I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, which is a private Swiss foundation that does low-profile, sometimes confidential mediation to try and avoid, to prevent or resolve armed conflict. Some of them appear in the media a little bit by accident. So, for example, the surrender of the Basque group ETA was facilitated by our center. And back here at the United Nations, maybe I recall that the Black Sea Grain Initiative between Russia and Ukraine started as an HT project that I took to Secretary General Guterres as part of the High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation. So I'm a mediator. I started in official life, and now I'm sitting on the outside looking in.
Great. There is an article you wrote in 2024 about the trajectory of formal diplomacy between the end of World War II and recent years, as a story of success at first and then progressive decline more recently. When I happened on this article, I was really, really enthralled by this vision of formal diplomacy reaching a sort of apex and then losing grip on certain processes, especially we're talking about peace and security. So could you condensate this part of diplomatic history for our audience to set the scene for the episode? How, World War II until now, this kind of apex and decline of diplomacy for peace?
No, with pleasure. And it's a terrible story. I mean, it's in a way the lost art of diplomacy. So the heart of it is that in the period after World War II, the world was able to use diplomacy to address its existential threats. Now, there is more to diplomacy than existential threats. We're here in Geneva, where everything from, the intellectual property to the bandwidth of the electromagnetic spectrum is being discussed. But the existential threats are important because if you don't deal with them, there's nothing left. And of course, after World War II, the principal existential threat was the threat of nuclear warfare. And what's interesting as a student of diplomacy and of modern history is that as you look back, you see that the Soviet Union and the United States, I mean, they were in a life or death struggle, and yet they were able to deal with issues through diplomacy, such as first the status of Finland and second the status of Austria. But even more impressively than that, once we entered the age of nuclear Armageddon, mutually assured destruction in the late 1950s, there was the slow diplomatic effort to put in place an architecture that would diminish the risks that we would wipe each other out, including wipe ourselves out. And, that was arms control and détente. And, it's the non-proliferation treaty, then the SALT talks, and eventually the START and New START and the INF and Open Skies. And this whole architecture was created not because people loved each other or even because they trusted each other, but because they knew that if they didn't use this instrument of diplomacy well in the age of, Kissinger and Gromyko, who were not pussycats, Francesco, not pussycats at all, that if they didn't use diplomacy really well, the world might not survive another generation. And, Francesco, when the Cold War ended, the existential threats seemed to recede. And what's interesting for me as a mediator is actually, for a while, for 20 or 30 years, we still found ourselves able to make agreements. Many of the world's major wars were shepherded to their end, actually under United Nations leadership. And then since about 2007, the art of diplomacy has basically been lost. We more or less just shout at each other now.
That's a nice introduction to what we're going to discuss in this episode. In the same article, you maintain actually that as the list of global problems that require real solution is growing, there are no new tangible diplomatic propositions to solve them.
Absolutely.
So how does it play out in reality?
So last century, during the second half of the last century, there was basically one existential threat, one threat that could wipe out the human race. And that was the threat of nuclear warfare after the first atomic bombs were used in 1945. And the world responded quite effectively, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. And, there was no putting the genie back into the bottle, but they became quite good at genie management and making sure that the genie didn't wipe us all out. Now, this century, we have several more existential threats. We have climate. I was reading a Twitter feed the other day, and somebody said there's a new UN report that says that the world might be uninhabitable by 2100. Somebody from Cyprus, I think, replied and said, well, at least we'll still have the UN mission in Cyprus. So I don't know if that's true, but we have a major climate threat. We may also have a large pandemic threat because of the size of the population, the zones of zoonotic transfer, and the lack of control over those areas. Artificial intelligence, before the show, you and I were talking about the amazing things that artificial intelligence can do. And you were making the excellent point, if you're impressed by that, just wait a few years, what's coming. We haven't yet begun. And what's interesting to me is, that during the 20th century in diplomacy, form followed function. There was a particular threat, which was really a bipolar threat between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so a certain type of bipolar diplomacy grew up. When it needed to be multilateral, the bilateral sort of worked in rhythm with the multilateral, like the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But somehow the forms of diplomacy were engineered to meet the problem. Well, I don't know, Francesco, if you go to the COPs, the climate COPs, but it's a mess, and it's hard to believe that this is the diplomatic response to a problem of not dissimilar scale to the nuclear threat. So I do think that what we have forgotten about is how the bilateral diplomacy works, but we've also failed to develop a new set of diplomacy properly adapted to the different nature of the threats we are facing today.
And one of the things that you write about is that the decline of diplomacy or formal diplomacy is noticeable in both Western and non-Western countries, but with some differences there. And I would like you to describe those differences for your audience.
Yeah, and you'll have to censor me if I say anything wrong about your member states. But I would say that, let me turn back the clock. When diplomacy as we understand it, evolved in Italy during the Renaissance, it was about an emissary sent from one city-state. The ruler of Genoa might send an emissary to the ruler of Venice and say, what about we divide the spoils, or you try this, or we stop squabbling over Pisa, or, whatever. And diplomacy was about quiet, empowered conversation between emissaries. And Francesco, the particular feature of diplomacy in the current age is that's largely dead. Diplomacy among many of the Western actors starts with not talking to people you don't like. So I think particularly in the Western camp, there is a tendency to show your displeasure by refusing to talk. You know, there's an Asterix book where Asterix goes to Spain, and there's an incredibly annoying little brat called Pepe, I think, who they have to babysit for. And every time anybody says anything bad or asks Pepe to do anything, Pepe holds his breath and goes bright red. Somehow Western diplomacy has become like Pepe. So I would say structural changes in governance and communication have driven changes in diplomacy that have fundamentally changed the nature of diplomacy from what was given birth to in the Renaissance and, was carried to its absolute height, probably at the Congress of Vienna, and which served us nevertheless very well in the middle part of the 20th century when we were reinventing a world after this appalling World War II, but which now has basically turned into a competitive insult match with people you don't like. So rather than diplomacy being about quiet give and take and finding mutual interests, it's really often about denouncing those you don't approve of or signaling to your own public that you are a tough guy and you're not going to make any concessions. And that makes, that's probably good politics, but it's horrible policy. It makes it incredibly hard to manage the real problems that are facing the world.
How does the fact that 90% of diplomacy now is traceable on Twitter, the Twitter accounts of the very actors involved in negotiations or visits to about stuff while they're flying to the country, their visits, if they're a foreign affairs minister, how much of that has an impact on this decline of formal diplomacy, and how much of that is still compensated by the quieter diplomacy, of which the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue is one example. There may be others.
So I would like to be able to tell you that the bombast and bravado and braggadocio of Twitter communications that all our leaders do now is that it's complemented by a really cool, measured willingness to engage and to find common ground and to compromise. I would like to be able to say that, and I can't. I think the innocent members of the public, perhaps the innocent listeners of your podcast, assume that the profession of diplomacy continues, even if president of the world's most powerful country or, the world's most populous country, the prime minister of are sort of blowhards on Twitter. You assume that somehow business is being done. And yet to a substantial degree, Francesco, that's not the case. What you don't see isn't there. And I think with respect to the management of the existential threats, like nuclear weapons, for example, we are tweet by tweet actively dismantling what an earlier generation of diplomats put in place. And there is no quiet diplomacy making sure that it's all okay on the day.
Is it possible that the fact that so much diplomacy is a show for public consumption, how much of that affects the posture of diplomacy? If we are alone in a mediation room, it's totally different if everybody is reading me, because then I assume that I should be saying those things that they need me to be saying.
Absolutely. I think only a generation ago, there was very little expectation from the general public that their leaders would be communicating with them in real time about the blow-by-blow negotiations. So, but partly due to the social media, we live in a world of, amplified bubbles of opinion in which the heart of diplomacy, which is give and take. You find issues on which you can concede, however painful, because you think you can gain something even more valuable. That whole logic largely crumbles in the face of engaging in diplomacy in front of a public which has been ginned up by an algorithm which drives you to greater and greater extremes. So the very idea of compromise in China, the idea of compromise with the United States, or in the United States, the idea of compromise with China, that's repugnant to a lot of the people you are communicating with. I mean, they would probably say in theory it would be nice if the two countries could agree. But in fact, tweet by tweet, issue by issue, the nature of public communication has undermined the capacity of diplomacy to keep the world safe from its major risks.
And this is what we find in the article. We'll reference the article in the notes to this podcast. And then if we want to move the conversation now to part 2, reversing the decline, I remember hearing you in a public event here in Geneva at the Graduate Institute, where you were talking about what could be done as risks grow and the tools to respond to them actually weaker. And one of them is the formal diplomacy processes you were talking about. So what can we do?
Well, there are modes of diplomacy which to some extent mitigate the decline of the risk posed by the decline of diplomacy in other areas, for example. So, I mean, you're working for the United Nations. I used to work for the United Nations. We're all extremely familiar with how the current international system makes formal multilateral diplomacy very difficult. And yet I think there are forms of ad hoc transactional, so-called minilateral diplomacy that are working quite well. I think, by the way, in general, we simply live in a much more transactional age. You and I are about the same age. And when we were growing up in the late Cold War, for better or for worse, politics was about ideas. You supported the idea of market democracy, or perhaps you supported the idea of Marxism or whatever. But when we were youngsters in our 20s and maybe into our 30s, ideas were at the heart of politics, particularly international politics, but all politics. And then I think in the post-Cold War period, we entered into a period where that was less true, and there was something of a return to the tribe, identity politics, and many, from the Rwanda genocide to the nightmare of the former Yugoslavia and so on. What we saw was the revenge of history, in a way, the revenge of the tribal imagination. But now we live in a purely transactional age where we even seem to be moving beyond identity. So, I mean, just to take, one example, India is largely aligned with Russia on the war in Ukraine and reaps certain economic benefits from that. I mean, I'm not at all saying India is unique in any way in that. But the same India, so it stands sort of in line with China, as it were, in support of its position on the war in Ukraine. However, with respect to relations between India and China, India stands with the United States and a whole different set of actors, including the so-called Quad. So what you see is these very ad hoc constellations of actors agglomerating. And I think the most supple, the most flexible diplomacy we have is in the same spirit. You can deplore it, and I'm not sure the diplomacy of ideas was necessarily a happy place when the confrontation between market democracy and communism brought its own huge risks. But this complete absence of ideas brings a different set of risks, and it brings certain types of natural transactional relationships. And I think the most effective diplomacy going on is diplomacy that understands that and finds ways of connecting people around those goal-oriented transactional deals. And a lot of that really is confidential, and I think that is mitigating a lot of the world's risk. The main problem is it doesn't work for the very large problems for which true multilateralism is required, like climate or AI or so on.
So this is the concept that you introduced in the article of shifting constellations.
Yeah.
This is what you're referring to.
Yeah.
How this shifting constellations mechanism could help us going forward. Now we have the Pact for the Future that offers multiple geometries for alignment, sub-alignments, realignments. So in that spirit of perhaps transactionalism, if we have to create a new word for our time, these shifting constellations...
It's a good word, by the way, Francesco.
Isn't it?
I think I might use that one.
So
the latest ism.
One of the isms that we live immersed in. How could that work? Would this shifting constellation become a tool or a way of doing things that we could use while we head towards solving global problems that might require actually a higher level of consciousness from our civilization, but while we get there?
Yeah. I mean, if I can use a sort of Geneva metaphor, we don't use realism, diplomatic realism, or in the sense that international relations scholars use it, is a Newtonian theory. It's, like those Newton's cradle where one metal ball bangs into a line of metal balls and a metal ball at the other end goes off flying somewhere. Realism assumes national interests, and it assumes that each metal ball is a discrete entity that interacts and according to its weight of power and its national interest with other metal balls, one of which is called the United States, one of which is called China, one of which is called Germany, so on. But the reality both of the world and of what is possible in diplomacy is much more like a quantum model in which the particles of the international system include private companies. I mean, there's Elon Musk, who's a major player in the war in Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine probably couldn't fight on without his Starlink. And then you have voices from public and from interest groups via social media. You also have little, actors like the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue that I work with, which is by no means the only one. And what's interesting is you have these not just variable geometries, but asymmetric geometries. So, one example, which we were talking about just before the show, was the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So there, before it was ready for prime time, as it were, our little center was able to test it with Ukraine and with Russia and with some of the other countries that would be required. And then Turkey and the United Nations, so there you have a non-governmental organization at the beginning. Then you have a country and the world's principal multilateral organization. Then you have a bilateral negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. And then you still can't get to an agreement, but then the African Union weighs in and China makes a helpful intervention. So what strikes me as interesting about that case, which was, a big success in that, so much grain was exported that it was able to help avert a global food crisis, that was possible because of a very strange hybrid collection of actors who, but those are the actors of the new international system. They're very heterogeneous, and they are gingerly, sometimes clumsily, trying to figure out how to work together. And I think the private sector actors, the non-governmental actors, the advocacy actors, the multilaterals, the bilaterals, we like to say that we understand this and work well with each other, but we don't yet, and we better learn fast because the problems we are confronting as a world are piling up.
There is shifting constellations from your article and from your talk. I also remember you talking about hybrid diplomacy. Now, I never heard about that before, and maybe some in the audience haven't either, and alternative diplomacy. So can you guide us a little bit to explore what's alternative diplomacy, what's hybrid diplomacy, how do they work?
Well, for me, alternative diplomacy is simply that diplomacy which is not the official representatives of states or of intergovernmental organizations. So, where Microsoft has the equivalent of a foreign ministry, and that's an alternative type of diplomacy, which has aspects of lobbying, but so frankly does national diplomacy. So all diplomacy which is outside of the sphere of, the Congress of Vienna, as it were, the world of Talleyrand and Metternich. And then one feature of the current international system is this hybridity, which is you don't just have the official actors, bilateral or multilateral, and you don't just have the private sector actor. It's not as though Microsoft is making the United States irrelevant. It's simply becoming a diplomatic pole in its own right. And then there is diplomacy transacted by actors who never existed before. The center I work with is one, but there are many others. I mean, there's a super interesting one in Italy, the community of Sant'Egidio, which is a lay organization. It's not part of the Catholic Church, but it's within the Catholic Church, which does fantastic work in a way that traditional diplomacy can't, because one of the positive and negative factors of classic diplomacy is that it's run in a highly hierarchical, top-down system where one person or one set of leaders has control over a whole system. But one of the limiting factors of that is bandwidth. So even a great power, the United States or China today, can only cope with 2 or 3 crises at a time, and probably not even that. Whereas I think some of these actors, I mean, I just happened to mention Sant'Egidio, but, they are able to apply some of these diplomatic tools to conflicts that others might not have given much attention to, but which might be killing hundreds of thousands of people. And the world doesn't think at all, for example, about conflict in, just to choose one example, Mozambique. And yet that conflict, actually starting with the great work of our cousins at Sant'Egidio, involving many other organizations and countries too, has slowly been managed down. So anyway, so this hybridity, which is the concatenation of a constellation of very heterogeneous actors, is a feature of the international scene at the moment. And the capacity to bring those heterogeneous pieces into proper alignment is what I think is the art of good diplomacy these days.
Let's move to the final part of our conversation. And I thought we could take advantage of you being here to talk about futures of diplomacy. So if we just turn the spotlight towards the future, I would be curious to hear you about, is formal diplomacy and alternative diplomacy working together, for example? Reasonable guess for the future, one of the futures of diplomacy going forward, these two realities morphing into another one or learning to work together and bring just better results after all.
Well, first of all, let me say I'm not a great storyteller, and not all stories have happy endings. And so I do have to say that it's not at all evident to me that we will find the capacities to manage the new international context, that is the post-ideas and even post-tribal transactional context within which we live, or that we will find the right collection of heterogeneous actors to make an effective hybrid diplomacy. But, somehow, to use another Geneva metaphor, like Dr. Frankenstein, that great Geneva doctor who looked at the dismembered pieces of a corpse lying in his workshop in the Vieilleville 200 and some years ago, and then assembled a new life form, I mean, not an altogether happy one. Somehow the elements of a possible new living diplomacy are there. From this worrying level of transactionality in the international system, from this weirdly complicated hybrid sort of quantum model of actors, there are ways of working together. I mean, the Black Sea Grain Initiative is just one. But, actually the biggest war of recent years, even bigger than Ukraine and Gaza, was actually the war in Tigray in terms of the human suffering. And that was also resolved, or, at least for now it's calm, with a very hybrid set of actors. So I wouldn't say that I'm absolutely pessimistic, but I do feel that for the moment there is a limited capacity for us to deal with the existential threats that we face. I can't say exactly why that is, but I think part of it is just as human beings, we are very heavily wired to immediate problems. And several of the existential threats the human race face are not just beyond the electoral system. They're beyond the short term in general, because non-electoral democracies find themselves struggling to meet the same challenges. So I think the elements of a better diplomacy are there, but I'm not yet convinced that we are going to assemble those elements in a really effective way.
That certainly, I hear you. And that belongs, in my mind, more to the content or various contents than the context. So I heard you talk about, in the talk at the Goethe Institute, at one point you brought up setting priorities. And I think it's also in the article you wrote. And so it occurs to me now, as I listen to you, that perhaps the context would be the context of meeting complexity for what it is, really meeting complexity and setting priorities. How do you see that as a context around contents that could help the process of churning out better solutions? Not being optimistic or pessimistic, but what you say is very realistic in a way. But is that still the case if we meet complexity with the mind to setting priorities?
I think it does help, but it helps only up to a point. So I gave the example of how the Chinese government was very, very unhappy about the visit of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, and the response was to cut off communication with the U.S., including around some of the existential issues such as climate change. And I think in a sort of rational world, we actually have relatively clear shared priorities: not to blow each other up with nuclear weapons, not to destroy the world with climate change. There are maybe not a lot of things we can agree on, but they're very important things, and we can basically agree with what they are. But I think we find it difficult to ring fence even the priority areas because of this highly public, highly black and white, highly sort of algorithm-driven extreme positions that we need to take. And, and I think an old form of diplomacy is dying. It simply can't deal with that. I'm sort of paraphrasing Gramsci here, right? That a new one may be emerging, but, in between there may be the monsters of increasing violence and increasing climate devastation, which is what we're living through. And I think the question for all of us is, will we wake up before it's too late and take the elements for a new diplomacy that are there and put them to effective use, or will we not?
And in this future, here that you're describing now in the form of a question, what's the role of the UN in this future, in your opinion? Well,
first of all, people like to say that the UN is a creature of the world of 1945. I am a great believer that actually it has much more enduring value. That, in fact, until more or less now, interstate conflict largely disappeared from the international system with the passage of the UN Charter. The UN Charter, you're not allowed to invade countries anymore. You're not allowed to make colonies. The colonies will be free. You do have a right of self-defense, including collective self-defense. It was an incredibly good set of rules for managing the international system. Billions of people literally became free under the Trusteeship Council and the decolonization process, the logic of the charter, the self-enforcing logic was very, very powerful. So for me, there is a framing role for the United Nations that's still incredibly important. The United Nations, in its wisdom, created in San Francisco, a Security Council to provide over the management of that existential risk. The members of it might or might not be well adapted to the world today, but the incapacity of the Council to find consensus on the spreading virus of conflict is a major issue whose only realistic solution is a return to the functionality of the Council. We can hope that it will be restructured and have different members, but first, the Council itself has to assume its responsibilities. The Council has not taken a consequential decision since the early months of 2011, when it authorized an intervention in Libya, Resolution 1973, I think. And it has taken some decisions, made resolutions with respect to Syria and Yemen, but they suffer from an unreality. So I am a believer that UN reform is great, but first we have a political agenda of encouraging at least the permanent 5 member states of the Security Council to assume their obligation. As I've said, it's not the solution to every problem, and it's under a lot of strain, but it's an incredibly powerful document, the UN Charter, and for better or for worse, it doesn't get better than the Security Council.
It's an interesting point of view, and it brings to mind the path for the future.
And I say this as an NGO, can you believe it?
Absolutely. I was about to mention that, and it comes from an NGO. So as we wrap up the episode, many things you've said would sound like a final thought, portable and memorable, but I want to give you another chance because I know that you can throw out these portable and memorable thoughts for our audience, to leave with our audience so they can take this away, among the other things that taking away from this episode.
Well, I wish I had a snappy one-liner, but I don't. I mean, all I can say is the world has the tools for the management of these huge and growing and existential problems. We have put those tools aside, essentially in a context of how public communication works. And either we are going to grapple with that issue and we are going to assemble a well-adapted diplomacy to the problems that we are now confronting, or we won't. But if we don't, the 21st century will be our last.
Oh, that's a final thought. David Harland, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the next page together with us. I hope to see you again for more episodes on the many other things that you have learned and done in your life of a diplomat, mediator, and UN staffer. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.